So again, hello everyone and welcome. Good afternoon. Welcome to our March session of our year-long Hispanic Serving Institutioning webinar series centering servingness. And again, as y'all are trickling in, we'd love to get to know who is in the audience today. So please introduce yourself and where you're joining us from. My name is Carla Silva and I serve as the Director for Hispanic Serving Institution Initiatives at the University of Arizona. And I'm excited that today our community includes folks from the University of Arizona, as well as folks from across the country on behalf of HSI initiatives here at the U of A. So as always, I do want to begin by recognizing and paying honor to the land that the University of Arizona is on. So again, this specific region in Tucson includes the ancestral homelands of the Tohono O'odham Nation and the Pasquayaqui tribe. We offer our gratitude in being able to share knowledge and learn from one another on these indigenous lands. So we also always like to make sure that we share a little bit about why we have this webinar series and why we continue to do it year after year. So informed by Dr. Gina Garcia's extensive body of work on the concept of servingness, this webinar series features faculty and staff who engage in scholarship and servingness efforts that honor the cultures and lived experiences of our student communities, of our staff, and our faculty. So again, the goals of these series are threefold. One, by spotlighting current scholarship, we offer examples of the rich ways in which servingness is enacted on our college institutions. Two, we invite others both on campus, in our community, and nationally to learn about and engage in these efforts. And three, we build knowledge. So each month we will address the question, what next steps are needed to build institutional capacity around HSI servingness? And lastly, just to give you a little bit of context, the University of Arizona received its HSI designation in April of 2018. We were the first four-year public institution in the state of Arizona to be recognized as an HSI. And in 2019, we received the inaugural Seal of Excellencia. We want to again just remind you that in Arizona we have 21 HSIs, and we also have the AZ HSI Consortium that was launched in 2021. So again, it's about really strengthening the collective within our state, but also nationally. So I'm extremely excited today that you all get to hear from some incredible folks, both here at the U of A, but also from an institution not in Arizona, and you will get to hear from him soon. But again, it is my honor today to introduce first Dr. Gabriel Bermea, who will be sharing who he is, as well as introducing the folks who are joining us from UPAC here at the University of Arizona. And again, today's webinar is Servingness in Advising, Understanding Structures of Advising at HSIs. Our presenters will share for about 40 minutes, and at that point, we will be opening up some Q&A with our UPAC folks as well as with our audience. So if you have questions as folks are talking or if something just comes up for you, we strongly encourage you to either use the Q&A feature or the chat feature and put that question there and we will get to it if we can. And if we can't, we are happy to share the questions we don't get to with our presenters and they can kind of come up with some answers and we can email those to anyone who did register for today's event. So again, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Dr. Gabriel Bermea.
Well, buenas tardes, everybody. It's good to see you all in this virtual space and to be in community with you today. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Dr. Gabriel Bermea, and I currently serve as a visiting scholar with the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions, where in that role, I study MSIs. As much as I love all my MSIs, but HSIs are where my heart lies, if I'm going to be honest. As a higher ed practitioner for over a decade, I was really on the student success side of things, working on retention, persistence, and completion initiatives for a couple of HSIs in my work, in addition to some emerging HSIs, as well as some, I believe, PBIs, if I think about it correctly. While I've done that work, as I started my scholarly work as in my dissertation and whatnot, HSIs and student success were really at the center of my work, and advising, which was a large part of my work, became a true space of passion and interest of mine that has emerged into a full-on scholarship for myself in the study of minority serving institutions, and specifically how HSIs themselves structure and organize themselves to more intentionally embrace servingness as well as intentionality. right, in their efforts to advise, in our case, students. So I'll let our panelists introduce themselves as well before we get started. So I will pass it on to, let's just say, popcorn to Miss Debra.
Hello, everyone. My name is Debra Armand-Cade. I am the Assistant Director of Academic and Support Services and Computer Science here at the University of Arizona. I've been in higher ed for about 21 years, been an academic advisor for almost 18. So really enjoy advising. Let's do Juliana.
Hi, everyone. I'm Juliana Lincoln. I'm currently a senior academic advisor in the Systems and Industrial Engineering Department. I've been advising at the U of A for going on 7 years, and my background is in rehab and mental health counseling. So excited to be here with you all.
I'll go next. My name is Emily Burruel Bonney, and I'm a senior academic advisor and online advisor in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. I've been back at U of A for about 3 or 4 years now, although I've been in higher education for much more than that. And I'm a first generation graduate of the U of A, first generation professional, and figuring out what that looks like going forward.
Wonderful. We're excited to have a conversation with everybody in the next 40 minutes or so. So we'll do our presentation, and then shortly after, we'll engage some of our panelists here, our lovely colleagues, and some of the questions that we've got inquiring about some of the work and the research that are being presented. And then we will open up the floor, if you will, to all the participants so we can engage in a more meaningful conversation as well, building up what we are going to share, building upon what we're going to share today. So let me go on and get my screen sharing here. If I can remember my work here. Here we go. We'll do our little slide presentation here. And I'm going to ask if you can use your emojis at the bottom with some thumbs up if you can see the screen. So we are good to go. Awesome. And I'm seeing some. Fantastic. All right. So servingness in HSIs, understanding structures of advising at Hispanic serving institutions. So servingness in advising. So again, I shared a little bit with you about myself. I currently serve as a visiting scholar. My research again is in HSIs, specifically exploring the profession of advising and student success within the organizational context of minority serving institutions. I have here for you my LinkedIn QR code. You are welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn, where I post a lot of my research that I do on HSIs, specifically in the advising sector. I do have a report coming out, hopefully in the next 2 weeks, that actually explores HSIs and how they train their academic advisors, the methods in which they train their academic advisors, the competencies, as well as the professional development activities that HSIs allow and promote academic advisors to do while they are building their craft as advisors. So if you want to get some of that information as well as some of my future research, please connect with me and follow me there. All right. We're going to do an overview today. We're going to go over a little bit on Latino enrollment in higher education, give us some context, right? HSIs in particular, some of the intersectionality that exists between HSIs and advising and the research that we're seeing. We're also going to go a little bit into the opportunity and the purpose of my research and the design, and I'm share with you some findings before we get to the panelists and some questions. So that's our roadmap for this afternoon. Okay. So let me go to here. All right. So over the last 20 years, we know that Latino enrollment in higher education has significantly increased. Numbers show over 131%. Today, Latinos actually represent 3.6 million students in higher education system, which means they represent about 1 in 5 students. This rise has naturally in the academic advising community has invested into research and scholarship focused on understanding the advising experience of Latinos, even when fostering the creation of a new advising community, which was launched about 2 years ago under Dr. Nicole Gonzalez's leadership. So kudos to Dr. Gonzalez for helping us get that initiative off the ground. It's in its second year now, but it has really driven some analysis into inquiring how we more intentionally advise Latino students. Latinos are the focus of advising research, though I will say it is extremely limited. There is much still that we need to learn about how we more effectively advise with intentionality and with servingness in mind Latino students. What we do know is that, yes, Latinos rate academic advising as one of the most essential services, and institutions responded by making more intentional advising experiences. They said yes. In a 2008 research by SESI, we found 2018 research by SESI, we said, hey, Latinos are really calling. They see the value of advising, and institutions, they started to respond in more meaningful ways. We saw culturally responsive strategies positively impact Latinx students, right? We have a lot of research on some of that that's been coming out over the last, I would say, decade or so. I say a lot, but I put that in context, right? It's not nearly as much as we had hoped to see. Third, we also see that Latinos report negative influences with advisors, right? We see a lot coming around, and we did see institutions respond. And we're also seeing that it being advising is linked to Latino student success, retention, persistence, and completion. This research really sets the stage for how we understand the Latino experience when it comes to advising. Now, you may say that's all we have on Latinos experience. Pretty much, right? We need so much more that we need to understand. Now, at the same time, while we saw the Latino enrollment increase, we also saw the rise of HSIs increase, right? HSIs, as many of you know, are accredited degree granting public or private nonprofit institutions in higher education with 25% or more total undergraduate Hispanic full-time equivalent student enrollment. Oh, that's a mouthful. Gotta love the legislative language for that, right? Now, today we know Excelencia as well as HACU tracks the number of HSIs that exist in the US today. And as of last year, there were 600 HSIs. I believe we'll be getting an updated number any day this coming month, which is typically the month they release the new reports. But as of last year, there were 600 HSIs total. These HSIs enrolled 63% of Latino undergraduate student population, yet represented only 20% of all colleges and universities. Perhaps not surprisingly, that's again 1 in 5, right, institutions across the US, right? This naturally prompted researchers to begin exploring HSIs. We see lots of research over the last decade, 20 years or so, that really has focused on Hispanic serving institutions. We've seen research on defining, identifying, and describing HSIs through their political and racialized constructs. We've also seen deconstructing of what it means to be an HSI and to serve rather than enroll Latino students. We've also seen the literature bring up an understanding and analysis of Latino enrollment, HSI enrollment, retention and completion, and post-completion efforts, and Title V funds at HSIs, and how they differ from other institutions. Furthermore, we also see identifying strategies and practices that serve Latinos while serving all, right, students, and demonstrating their impact on Latino student success. When we cross these two subjects, HSIs and advising, the literature is extremely rare, right? We do have a couple of things that have come out in Dr. Garcia's books that highlight advising, 1 or 2 chapters, but when you really start digging into the literature, it's just beginning to emerge, right? HSIs, for example, we know are continually evaluating their advising programs to ensure that they are positively influencing student success, and they use data to inform the evolution of advising practices and resources. We also see HSIs place a great value on academic advisors who are equipped with intercultural communication skills, a strong commitment to anti-racism, and a strong cultural competencies, in particular, cultural humility. We also see HSI's academic advisor training often emphasizing informational and technological competencies, yet frequently overlooking the crucial areas of conceptual understanding of advising as well as anti-racism. Furthermore, the responsibilities of an advisor at an HSI encompass a wide range of duties and responsibilities. When we look at the duties, they can be summed up in essentially 7 different areas: recruitment and registration, coaching and development, intervention and support, teaching and learning, service to campus, career education and development, and wellness and well-being. There's a number of duties within each of those respective areas that support each of those components and really speak to the multifaceted nature and range of duties and multifunctional nature of academic advisors at HSIs. We also note that HSIs implement culturally relevant and arguably culturally congruent, I would say, academic advising practices that effectively support students through their educational journey. We've seen HSI leadership recognize advising as a crucial strategy. I'll emphasize the word strategy rather than practice given the context of this research for achieving institutional student success goals, and they are actively seeking ways to invest in advising. Though we're seeing this investment lean more towards grants than hard money. Okay. At least that's my hypothesis and observations. Finally, we start to see HSIs engage academic advisors in investing in professional development experiences. They value the importance in training of microaffirmations, addressing microaggressions, and fostering sense of belonging and to enhance academic outcomes for their students. We see that the most common value and the common use in the literature is intrusive advising as a study. We see intrusive advising because it prompts continuous term enrollment as a benefit. Furthermore, it aligns with the ethnicity of the advisors in this particular study, with that advisors have found and advisees have found to be a very significant component in the perceived value of their advising experience. So, for example, if the advisor is Latino and the advisee is Latino, they find value in that experience that enhances the advising experience for both student and advisor. These are what we're seeing over the last few years about academic advising and HSIs. You'll note that first slide, really a lot of my research, but we've also seen some things from, like I said, Excelencia, Hernandez, Castro, and Castro, who have all provided key components in evolutionizing the work that we're seeing at HSIs and helping us better understand what's on the ground. So, while the rise of Latino enrollment ignited research in the academic advising community, the same was really not true for HSIs, right? HSIs have just come up in the last, I would say research on HSIs and advising has just come up in the last 5 years or so, right? Maybe the last decade, I'm sorry. The HSI identity is rarely an often unit of analysis, is really not common in these studies. It is often the Latino or the advising experience that's focused on. So we have a research opportunity. Today, we know that HSIs enroll 63% of Latino students. However, I'd like to do a little slight edit to that statement. In other words, HSIs also advise 63% of Latino undergraduates in the US. When you shift the concept from enrollment to advising, my question then becomes, is your institution at scale have the proper structures in place to effectively and more intentionally advise your Latino population, right? And students in all categories. Yet despite this critical responsibility, there remains a significant gap in understanding the advising efforts deployed by HSIs within the organizational context. Hence the research. We're all, given the nature of the Servingness webinar series, we're all familiar, I would hope, with Dr. Garcia's work on Servingness. This organizational theory has really reframed the conversation around how we Hispanic serving institutions, in fact, serve their populations, right? She talks about structures, indicators of servingness, structures of servingness, and servingness in practice, right, in her literature. Structures for servingness are those organizational in nature and often require transformation in order to better serve Latinx students, right? This focuses on how HSIs go beyond enrolling to holistically support the academic and personal success of their students on their campus. Now, having studied the work of Dr. Garcia and having worked for Excelencia, I often feel I have to talk about intentionality, all right? Excelencia talks a lot about intentionality in their work. In other words, what it means to serve, right? How we are making deliberate efforts to address the unique challenges and opportunities faced by Latino students through a strategic use of data, planning, and effort, right? Data, practice, and leadership to get to their framework, right? These combinations, servingness and intentionality, are really shaped how we, HSIs, view and consider our work in serving Latino students, right? It is through these two lenses that I consider the work about, well, how are we doing this in advising? Do we lean towards servingness or intentionality, or are we somewhere in the middle? What are the structures of servingness? I did a qualitative research study a couple of years ago that looked at 23 HSIs. We did an open survey that asked particular questions around these surrounding areas. We asked about competencies, we asked about the purpose, the models, the organizational structures, the approaches, we asked about their populations that they advise, social media platforms that they engage, as well as strategies and practices of academic advisors at HSIs. Pretty lengthy open-ended questionnaire. They answered the questionnaire, we gathered that data, we analyzed it. I used thematic analysis to identify some codes and categories and organize them to give us some more themes and structures along the way. So this brings us to our research and our findings. The first thing we've noted is that HSI's strategic purpose for advising is common with the first two, but incredibly unique in my observations with the last three. We know that academic HSIs essentially leverage advising for a purpose of enrollment and student retention. That's common, that's frequent, that's consistent with the literature, which is amazing to see. And we're seeing it pay off. As we know, HSI male enrollment continues to increase, as well as HSIs as a whole, with Latinos continuing to increase their enrollment in higher education. We see it impacting in a good way. We also see student retention slowly on the rise at HSIs as well. What I found incredibly unique in the study, though, is that HSIs also saw a strategic purpose for advising in three unique ways. One, they saw advising as a strategic way for creating sense of belonging. Two, we also saw HSIs recognize that advising goes beyond course registration, that it is in fact a learning function. And then three, we saw HSIs voice the importance of advising, creating, and advisors creating familial learning environments to connect with their students in more meaningful ways. When we look at sense of belonging, we see academic advisors at HSIs being more intentional in their ability to welcome students, right? Meeting students as they are rather than where they are, right? In that way, they're able to create that sense of belonging, helping students facilitate connections on the campus that are more in line with that student's identity, their efforts, and their academic goals. That in turn creates opportunities to create, I think, the familial learning environments. Students feel more connected to their academic advisors because they feel seen, valued, and heard along the way. That familiar learning environment also extends to the families, as HSIs really begin thinking about how not only are they advising their students, but the families that those students come with, right? And those families serve as a part of the advising ecosystem at their institutions. And then finally, we see student learning as a strategic purpose, right? This is no longer a practice. This becomes a teaching and learning function. How are students learning from their educational experiences to enhance and reach their goals? What are they learning about themselves? How is their experience with the curriculum, their communication efforts, their study abroad opportunities, internships, etc.? How is all of that being reflected in a conversation that allows students to learn about themselves? I would argue through the journey of self-actualization, right? As they get a better sense of who they are and how they grow as individuals, ultimately contributing to their overall student growth and success. So we see these five purposes, these five strategic key areas for academic advising at HSIs: enrollment, retention, sense of belonging, student learning, and familial learning environments. The research also looked at advising models. We know very little about how HSIs themselves organize themselves within an advising structure for their institutions. And what we found was HSIs, at least in this study, deploy a range of advising models to organize themselves, right? Now, I offer this as a distinction from approaches. I think we're more common about approaches deals with practice, whereas models deals more with the structure, right? How have we organized the institution to deliver advising and provide tailored support to each student? We see HSIs deployed three different models. These models are found in the advising literature and are congruent with the literature at the moment. We see centralized models, meaning about a third of the institutions in the study had a centralized model, meaning every single student went through a professional advisor on their campus through a center of some sort. We also see a decentralized model, which another third said we have a decentralized model. In this model, that means each individual college has their own advising center. And with that advising center, we may have a center with that kind of coordinates some of the work, maybe coordinate some of the training or offer some kind of support along the way. But for the most part, each college does its own thing with its own advising center and they do their own thing, right? Then we saw another third say they had a shared model. where they had a split or dual model. Okay. A split model, if I remember correctly, and I'm challenging myself on the model itself, I think it's a split model that basically has the first 2 years are with an advisor, the second 2 years are with their faculty advisor. Maybe that's a dual model. I'm thinking it's a dual model. But nonetheless, that model in particular says, hey, we're going to spend 2 years with a professional advisor, and then we're going to hand you off to a faculty advisor the remaining 2 years. Now, either the split or the dual model, and I feel like this one's a split now. I'm questioning again myself. But the second model in the shared space is they may perhaps provide a centralized function that may see a certain population. For example, the first year students may go to the advising center, but every other student may then go to the second or third year students and fifth year students, however that may be, may go to another center or another faculty member outside, right? They're sharing the responsibilities across the campus, and they're distributed in different ways. Okay. These models deploy not only how they're responding to the student population, but how they're also meeting the demands of the colleges that best tailor and meet their students, their student needs to advising. All right. We then inquired about approaches. Approaches are perhaps the most common thing we talk about in advising, meaning how are we going to practice our advising efforts? We saw HSIs implement a variety of models, if you will, approaches to advising, right? Each one was actively designed to boost student motivation and success, ensuring a consistent guidance throughout their academic journey. We see 4 practices at play: proactive advising, prescriptive advising, developmental advising, and appreciative advising. When you look at these 2 components, they tend to fall into the learning theories of behaviorism for proactive and prescriptive, and then constructivism, developmental and appreciative. Okay. Appreciative advising is incredibly common and higher in the advising world, often considered to be, I would argue, the most reference. However, when we looked at HSIs leaned more towards proactive advising as their #1 approach, followed by developmental advising, prescriptive, then appreciative. What we hear is that they're not just using one approach, they're using multiple approaches to meet students where they are and as they are to effectively advise them in a more meaningful way. That's incredibly innovative. As a number of institutions tend to go to between a couple, HSI see the benefit of integrating multiple approaches to meet the needs of their students on their campus. Now, proactive advising is anticipating, if you will, a student's needs, right? They're trying to get ahead of an issue before it becomes a real issue. So they may be more proactive in their efforts to reach out to students to communicate with them as well. Developmental advising may perhaps be more towards the upper years, where they start inquiring about their career, their personal goals, and their academic goals in and of themselves. And they have those conversations that are more holistic and intentional in that way. Prescriptive advising is exactly what it says. I'm going to prescribe to you what you need to do. I'm going to tell you the action, right? So the power dynamics between proactive and prescriptive are very similar. Advisor here, if you will, and student here. Whereas developmental tends to be more of a co-creation component, as does appreciative advising. Appreciative advising is based on appreciative theory that Paul asks appreciative questions, leverages the student's strengths, interests, and abilities, and really helps them co-create a plan for themselves with their advisor on their academic journey. All 4 of these tend to be in the magic bag, if you will, of advisors at these HSIs within these studies, reflecting not only their ability to adapt to their student, but their knowledge and approaches and understanding of how each of these models are practiced and meet their students as they are. So we then ask, what are some of the key populations for HSIs and who are they advising with intention? This is quite interesting because we do know that proactive advising was the #1 model that was approach that was identified. So if that's in mind, well, who are they targeting? That means in most cases, what we do see is HSIs have more students and less advisors. Advisors are outnumbered, higher caseloads. So they tend to use proactive advising as a way to leverage data to identify certain populations who may need support. These are the top 5 populations that were identified by advisors at these HSIs. Students on probation and suspension were at the top of the list. We also saw first-year students that were requiring mandatory advising. Student athletes comes as no surprise given NCAA requirements. Transfer students, again, comes as no surprise given their matriculation between one institution to another. And our fifth population is graduating seniors, making sure that students who have everything they need to graduate and walk that stage are good to go by the time the end of the semester ends. These target populations are ensure that key student groups receive the mandatory advising and resources they need to thrive at their institution. Now, there were a number of identity-based populations that were identified, I would say around 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, right, that were on this list. However, given the population and the demographics of HSIs, a significant number of those students were often seen in the transfer population, first year population, and graduating student population. Okay. Those populations had a larger number in those targeted groups, so they saw those targeted groups as a key component as opposed to breaking them down by the ethnic or identity-based populations. Okay. We also see HSIs use social media. HSIs leverage social media platforms to keep students and their families informed and engaged in crucial advising information. This is a step where we begin seeing families as part of the advising ecosystem, not only to inform, but to support students in their advising experience. And some might even say, dependent upon the information that the advising center provided or the advising community provided, families also serve as advisors, if you will, to their students. We see that HSIs identified 8 different apps or social media platforms. This included Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, X, formerly known as Twitter, okay, TikTok, Snapchat, LinkedIn, and a homegrown institutional app of their own design and making. Now, what's interesting here is that we saw Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook all had similar yet distinct purposes. For example, YouTube was often used for training videos, how-to videos on how to register, how to set up your advising appointment. These functioned as learning opportunities to show students and walk them through the process. Instagram, for example, showed visual cues and information that a student may need on where to get to a certain point on campus or sharing an announcement that was visually engagement. Facebook tended to be a space more for families than it was for students, right? Moms, dads tend to leverage Facebook in and of itself to stay involved and understand what's happening with their student when it comes to advising and registration on the campus. And Twitter, or X, was often used for quick, up-to-date, immediate notifications that needed to go out to students, right? Those high visual, quick announcements that students need to know on the fly. We do see TikTok and Snapchat and LinkedIn on that profile, on this list of social media options. However, they are frequently less used. I would venture HSIs in particular said, hey, we're still learning how to leverage these platforms. We just really got familiar with these other platforms, but we're making our way to it. While less frequently used, they are very much on the radar, especially as they consider the upcoming generation. Now, another component, as I shared with you before, are HSIs themselves in my research have identified, along with other MSIs, 5 additional competencies that complement NACADA's 3 competencies. NACADA's 3 competencies were established in 2015, and they identified conceptual, informational, and relational competencies as critical foundations for the field of advising. However, when I asked HSIs and MSIs in the collective, I said, hey, do you have any particular competencies that you value? They actually identified 5 other ones. They identified cultural, technological, personal, intercultural communication, and anti-racism as essential competencies, and in some cases, extremely essential competencies. When you look at this heat map here, you will see that a competency is either essential or extremely essential. No competencies were identified as minimally essential. Everything was essential in the minds of those on campus. All right. HSIs, if you look at this column here, saw informational, relational, cultural, technological, intercultural communication, and anti-racism as extremely essential competencies for their advisors. You also saw, while less, but not entirely, they're still essential, conceptual and personal competencies were identified as essential. This is interesting when you consider the comparison among other HSIs, other MSIs, and how they value competencies for themselves. but across the board, these were considered essential competencies all across. And articulate really, advisors not only need to know more, but do more when they come to an HSI. So, what does this tell us about servingness and intentionality in advising? Well, when we look at the purpose, we see that there's a deep commitment to serving students beyond the transactional experience. They see the emphasis in belonging and learning a familiar relationship that aligns to this holistic, humanistic approach to student success. That's, for me, a connection to servingness. We see that purpose, we see the connection, we see how it's organizationally structured, and the strategy behind that. The next three really speak more, in my opinion, based off of intentionality. We see the models that are designed and are intentionally structured by the choices they make to provide a model of advising that deliberately integrates faculty and professional advisors, right? We see this through the decentralized, shared, as well as decentralized, and shared models of advising. In the approaching function, we see that proactive requires a level of intentional planning and execution, ensuring students receive guidances before they arise. That targeted intervention signals a powerful effort to drive student success. That is, in my opinion, again, based off of what we know of servingness and intentionality, falls within the intentionality structure. We see that as well with the target areas of the target populations, right? Mandatory advising for certain populations is highly intentional, giving to those areas to more intentionally serve their students and advise them in more unique ways. The communication strategies, however, when we look at the social media platforms, recognizes the level of servingness that we see with the advising practices. They use multiple platforms, particularly Instagram, suggest a servingness mindset, meeting students where they are and families where they are, and ensuring accessibility to advising resources in a more meaningful and intentional way, thus getting to servingness. So, what do we see here as some insights? Well, we see HSIs from advising blending servingness and intentionality along the way. These structures and strategies are designed with intentionality, but the overarching philosophy remains student-centered, right? Latino-centered. We see intentionality to drive the models and approaches that we see at HSIs, but we see servingness shaping the experience, again, getting to the purpose of academic advising, belonging, learning, and familiar environments. And we also see the communication strategies reflecting a servingness approach, leveraging social media to engage students and families, and reinforcing that student-serving institutional role when it comes to academic advising. We also see that there's a balance that is essential. While servingness may ensure efficiency and intentionality ensures efficiency and effectiveness, servingness ensures that advisory remains meaningful, culturally relevant, and student-focused. Thus, HSIs do not just provide advising as a service, but as an experience that intentionally fosters connection, support, and success. So what are some consejos that we have? Well, first, I would suggest, we can be more open to new social media platforms. Right now, I would say as a millennial myself, we were learning how to leverage social media in the very beginning, about 20 years ago when it came out, right? But now we have new platforms and a new generation that tends to prefer TikTok and Snapchat. We need to be open to those platforms to engage that new generation as they're coming up. If we're going to engage them, we've got to advise them in spaces where they are at times. 2, be aware that not every advisee requires mandatory advising. We tend to have a habit as a profession to put a hold on every student because we want them to see an advisor. The fact is, we can teach students as well how to identify their own courses. And while they may not always have to see an advisor a mandatory advisor, the advising is always open to them. But you know what? We may be able to trust our students in their own course selections along the way, as we see in some of the HSIs. Third, be more mindful that advising is more than course enrollment. Yes, we know it's connected to enrollment and retention, but as our HSIs show us, it's also connected to a sense of belonging, to student learning, as well as to creating familiar learning environments. These are not only cultural values to these institutions, but cultural values to the students who enroll in these institutions. Fourth, being cognizant that learning is a core function of advising. I think we can often lose sight that advising tends to be an enrollment function, and it is to a certain degree, but it is also a learning function. Students learn from their advisors. They learn from their advising experiences through questions of self-reflection, identifying their motivations, identifying their strengths and opportunities, learning opportunities that can enhance their experience while at the institution, and they can gain a more meaningful learning experience with their advisors as they learn more about themselves, their growth, their challenges, and their development. Fifth, be conscious that shared models of advising, right, dual and split, also require training for faculty advisors. One of the things that we do note is that, yes, it is a shared function. However, we see more of the training and development on the advisor side with very little training on the faculty advisor side. The opportunity exists there to bridge that and ensure that there's a more consistent, holistic, and effective advising experience for all students. And last but not least, be committed to a servingness philosophy in advising. What we do note is that, yes, servingness is there, but if we ask an institution like an HSI, what is your philosophy of advising for your students? That conceptual concept, the idea of embedding servingness into their philosophy, is really not there. Opportunities exist for HSIs to more organizationally design with the level of servingness and intention in mind. Their ability to craft this philosophy to more intentionally advise their students and have a more concrete approach to how they see advising practice in their day-to-day. And that, my friends, is almost, I was 3 minutes after. I apologize. That is us at time. That is all I have for you today. And I will open it up to my colleagues on the panel for questions.
Yes, so if we can have our UPAC folks come back on. We did prepare just a few questions for them. So we're going to ask them those questions so you can get, some perspectives from these folks who are doing this work day in and day out. And then we'll go ahead and open it up for Q&A from the audience. So if you have questions or something you want to ask, again, feel free to throw it in the Q&A function or use the chat feature already. But for our UPAC folks, our co-chairs, I did want to ask, how does your institution status as an HSI shape the unique needs and experiences of our student population in terms of academic advising? So whoever would like to answer that one first.
All right, I can go. So I think it's really interesting because a lot of what Gabe mentioned in his presentation are things that kind of come to front of mind as an advisor at an HSI. Some of the most important things that I like to think about are the proactive outreach attempts that we're giving students, the communication with them. Something that really resonated with what he was talking about is how many different avenues we use to communicate with students to make sure that we're meeting them where they're at. So we have our Instagram, we have Facebook, LinkedIn, we also have a Discord server specifically for our students. And then we also reach out to them via email. So trying to meet them where they're at. We do have different cultural events that we host in our department, and we heavily support one of our student clubs, the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers. So getting a variety of opportunities for our students to engage and feel that sense of community, I think comes from our communication with them, proactive and consistent communication with them. And then the other thing that comes to mind is sort of thinking from a student's perspective when we are communicating in the way we're communicating. I think especially with first year students or even first gen students, we tend to use our lingo like gen ed, DRC, ILC, things that if you've been at the university for a while, you might be familiar with, but are totally just not familiar for someone coming in. So being cognizant of that communication and the micro affirmations or aggressions that you might be using and trying to obviously limit the aggressions there, but then also explaining things like the acronyms and again, meeting the student where they're at.
For me as an online advisor, I think that the proactive approach and that intentionality as part of Servingness really comes in the actual advising appointment, or in the emails that we might share throughout the day. A lot of times those emails won't just be one here, it'll be a few, if that's the way the student prefers to communicate. So I think that being able to practice that from the first appointment, so that we'll continue to build that relationship, is really important. So I'm very honest in those appointments about my background, what my challenges are, and my experience. And I think with a quarter of my advising caseload being Hispanic or Latinx, I think that really comes through for them. But a challenge for me is really getting them in front of me, or getting myself in front of them, because they want to do everything themselves. They want to do it perfectly. They don't, a lot of my students are navigating these structures without other supports, with the exception of their family. And so they're relying on friends and other networks rather than just advising. And so I count it as success when I can really forge that bond with them, and that keeps them coming back to me, and helps them to be really take that initiative.
Yeah, to kind of piggyback off of Emily, that's exactly what I was thinking. Getting them in front of us is very an important piece of it, and it helps when we are building that trust and rapport, because many of them, just minority, overall most have an imposter syndrome in some way, right? So they feel like, is this something, especially if they're first gen, so it's like, am I supposed to be here? So it's, as Juliana spoke of, the words of affirmation, things to just let them know that you belong, and helping to connect them to the various resources across campus. And again, just keeping them coming back to us so that we can let them know of the resources and everything that are available here to help them.
And I think you all highlight, right, a lot of like the great things, but also the challenges, right, that you all face as advisors, and that you see your students maybe facing, and how really sometimes they're like these systematic barriers. So I really appreciate the honesty, and kind of, tying that again back to what Gabe was talking about a little bit ago. So I'll ask one more question, and then we'll open up to the larger group to ask questions. If not, we definitely have more questions as well. But for our advisors, in what ways has the HSI identity influenced maybe some of the competencies required for academic advisors to effectively support students? And some of you kind of already started touching upon this, but again, maybe going a little bit deeper into that.
I think one area that's been interesting is as an advisor, is to understand the broader scope of students' journeys in higher education. They look much different from when I was in college. And so students are coming to us with a variety of several transcripts instead of one. They're going to community college. We're not necessarily advising them to stay at U of A the entire time. We're kind of putting together a collection of resources that will help get them to graduation. And so I think being able, that adaptiveness or adaptability of the advisor is really important. It's okay to look outside your institution sometimes for something that will serve the student.
Thank you. So I do want to open it up to other folks in case there's other questions we have for any of our UPAC coaches, but as well as our presenting speaker. We'll leave it open for just a second, see if anyone has questions before we maybe move on to some of the other questions we have as well. Okay, so seeing no questions, I am going to move to the next question, and this can be for, again, any of whoever maybe wants to answer this one. But, how can we or have you seen, right, HSIs, whether here at the University of Arizona, or Gabe, in your research and the work that you do, how have you seen institutions leverage maybe their HSI designation to enhance the visibility and accessibility of advising resources and services that are specifically tailored to the students they are serving?
I'll jump in and say what I'm seeing is a lot of Title V funding. We're seeing advising elevate as, again, not just a practice, but a strategy for institutions, right? Considering how they are redesigning, reinvesting, and retraining. They're seeing those as three areas that tend to be quite common in their efforts. As they retrain, they're seeing a need for, exactly to what Emily was asking. We got our populations aren't what they were 10 years ago, right? Their journeys are not the same. So being ready to retrain their advisors, whether that's retraining them in soft skills, retraining them in models, retraining them in technology, they are investing in that retraining for their advisors. We're seeing reinvestments, meaning they are thinking about how they're going to build new centers, new structures, get more advisors as part of this grant with a particular focus. And we're also seeing redesigning, meaning we know what we were doing wasn't working, and they're throwing the book out and they're starting from scratch, right? They are taking the bold step to say, hey, if it's not likely to be transformational, why bother? Right? They want to redesign the advising experience, not just the advising practice, right? And so those are some three things that I'm seeing with regards to how they're leveraging that HSI identity to really elevate the work of not just advising, but the work of the advisor as well.
Anyone from UPAC want to answer that? Not totally. Oh, yeah, go for it.
I'm having a thought that sort of merges with the previous question a little bit. Just thinking about the competencies and how we can leverage that. So I think that I was excited to see the slide that you showed with the different the NACADA competencies and then the additional ones that were listed as extremely important for HSIs. And I think being culturally competent is something that is extremely important and something that we have put focus on in training, but we need to continue to do it. And that needs to continue to be something that we work on. I think in meetings with individual students or even just as a general population when we're working with students, it's those little things that create the sense of belonging, that keep them here, the retention, that draw them here. Something as simple as making sure you're pronouncing their name right, or just addressing something that might otherwise be like brushed under the rug. I think it's those little things in those interactions that we have with students that make the most difference. And so I think making sure that we are able to confidently just know that, be confident in our abilities in those competencies. I think that's something really important.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that we've done, I guess, that's many institutions across everywhere, I mean, just making advising appointments more accessible, right? Zoom, having Zoom appointments. We do have the ability now here through Zoom to text students, right? If they are opted into text, so reaching out to them that way and they're able to respond back via text. But I would love to definitely, I did like Gabe's ideas of different ways to try to engage via social media, meet them where they're at. So that's definitely another opportunity that we can kind of leverage for our student population.
I do think too, that kind of reminds me is something as simple as getting their feedback too, getting current student feedback and graduating student feedback on what worked and what went well. Because honestly, at the end of the day, they are the ones that we're serving. And so while the university's goal is a 4-year grad rate or a 6-year grad rate or retention. We as advisors are working with the student, yes, with that in the background, but also with their own defined version of success. And so whatever they view, I think it's really important for us to continue to get their feedback and not only just get it, but actually implement it. That's the hard part, is actually taking the feedback and figuring out what to do with it. And that's something that I think we have the intention to do, and we just need to continue being as proactive about that as possible.
Absolutely. No, thank you. I do want to, acknowledge we did get a question in the Q&A that was a little more general around our institution versus our advisors. And so the question was asked in there about, if cultural and resource centers are dismantled due to DEI mandates from federal government, how do we continue our work with supporting all our minority students, possibly when our institutions aren't? And I think, right, like and other folks can definitely jump in as they want. But within HSI initiatives, and we work pretty, collaboratively across the board with our cultural centers, with advisors. I've worked with Nicole a few times now, and really knowing that, and if folks follow Dr. Gina Garcia and the work that she does, she has, put out some stuff around, what does happen if these things happen, right? If a designation maybe doesn't exist, if cultural centers don't exist, because these students will continue to be at our institutions. And so I know a lot of it in our kind of realm in HSI initiatives has been around, our work will continue, right? We've all, as you can see, things like Servingness, things like, being aware of the needs of our students, not just our minority students, but all of our students, right? Creating a sense of belongingness on these campuses has to happen through everyone, right? So the work of the cultural centers and the work that they do is important, but should be done by everyone the same way Servingness should be done by everyone, right? Regardless of our own backgrounds and lived experiences. And so I think, right, there are some different pieces already out there that we have seen different folks like Dr. Garcia and other folks kind of, calls to action as to what could happen or what will happen. But I think, again, right, things like our webinar series and some other things can really help, or resources can help, right, to see like, well, how are we doing this work day in and day out in every aspect of higher ed and not just within one office or one space. I think that's, this is part of why we do this webinar series, is how do we see Servingness in advising, because we should see it there the same way we should see it in housing, in campus recreation, right, in all aspects. But I'll pause there. I don't know if there's anything other folks want to answer to that question. We are getting really close to time.
I would just add very quickly that servingness is an organizational theory, not a DEI theory, right? That's a very, for me, it's an organizational theory, right? I would also say that intentionality is not a DEI theory. It is a practice, right? It is an approach, right? It is a data-driven approach, right? There is a framework for that, right? Excellencia has data, practice, and leadership. That is within the context of Latino students, right, for their organization and their purpose, but is easily transferable to every population, right? It's everybody's work. So for me, those two components are how the work keeps going, right? And as Carla said, yes, the work continues, and I would also say the work evolves, right? So we continue, we move upward, and we continue to serve with intentionality. And so, yeah.
And I'll add to that. I think in the event that something that happens, as this closest thing continues, that advising, I think, will be really central to that. I see this with online students who don't have access to a lot of the cultural resource centers and support networks that on-campus students do. It is me and them and everyone they know. And so it's a lot for an advisor. And so I think that responsibility will fall a lot to advising teams and colleges potentially, and supporting advisors to take on that extra caring work.
I know we're at time, so I will keep this extremely brief. But to piggyback off of what everyone has said here, I think I can speak personally for myself that I am committed to our students. And I know so many I could say a good majority of our advisors, if not all, are. So in the unfortunate event that something were to happen to those centers and funding for that, I know that we would still see the servingness. It would just look a little different, and we would still have to figure that out. But I know that individually, I am committed to the students, to equity and diversity, and that is something that I will always have in my individual advising philosophy. So, and I know that many people feel that way, and that we would not give up on that simply because of the mandate or the funding being gone.
No, thank you all. So, as always, we have kind of our final question to our facilitators. So, whoever would like to answer this, or if multiple people want to, you're welcome to. But we always like to ask our panelists or our facilitators, what next steps are needed to build institutional capacity around HSI servingness?
I have one right off the bat that immediately comes to mind. And there's going to be so many. But the first thing that comes to mind is bringing awareness to leadership and faculty, because advisors play such an important role in each of the departments as staff members. There's can be a bit of a disconnect between staff and faculty, and ultimately faculty are the ones in leadership as you get higher up in administration. And so I think that continued collaboration and just awareness, we try to bring trainings to our faculty, but I think it needs to go a bit beyond that. I think that that is something that needs to be not necessarily promoted as optional, but mandatory for trainings and things like that, simply to start with that awareness, because it's something that, if it's an optional training, the people who want to learn more, who might not need it, are the ones attending, and the ones who probably need it might not see the value of it until it's mandated. So that's, I think, just getting faculty, and I'm not saying that all faculty are not, that we have a great faculty here, but I think just overall that would be something to really make sure the awareness is there at that level.
I agree. I also think that more advisors, I think that in servingness and intentionality takes more time. It's more personal. And we would benefit students and advisors alike in the university from having lower caseloads where we can do that work and do it well.
I would say in my research, what I'm seeing is, and this seems to be across the field of advising is still framed as a practice. And because it's framed as a practice, it's not always elevated to what we're asking for, right? So we're asking about addressing caseloads, you're asking about elevating training, right? And the function of advising. In the research that I have with these 23 institutions, I see advising reflected as a strategy. So it tells me it's going that direction, but not every HSI is at that level, right? They're still focusing on what I would argue is the intentionality part of it, right? The action to serve. So elevating it to servingness requires the institution to address what Nakata calls the conceptual competency, right? To really devise a definition of advising for their institution, to create a philosophy of advising that elevates it to that level, that builds in the infrastructure that can address the caseloads, that can address the trainings that are needed, right? That conceptual component is missing from the conversation, and that's what needs to be elevated to get to that level of servingness that we're looking for at HSIs. So that would be my observation and my thoughts based off of the research.
Those are all great. I definitely second all of those too. Going to twist my just a little, maybe a little more family and community engagement, right? Because we want to serve the students, right? And they have their Latinx community, family, that's a big part, right? So why not engage the family more in ways if we can? Maybe some organizations, some Latinx organizations that can help us in our advising approaches and outreach, or maybe even, I don't know, a family advising night. I know that might be out there, but just something to just bring the families who are there when these students go home, right? And they can help them and support them in that way, especially if they're first generation. We can have a English and Spanish outreach event.
I love all of these. These are so great. And, again, we love to ask that question because it is, right? Like it's something for you all to think about as experts within advising and working with and for and alongside, HSI, students, staff, and faculty. So it's always something, right, to ponder, right? And then maybe even take back to your own institution about like, wait, could we do this? What would that maybe look like, right? And so who are the key stakeholders and who maybe do we have to get on board? And so I think, Gabe, you said something earlier about like, right, it's always evolving, right? So servingness, all of these things are always evolving, and we do too as folks who are working in these spaces. So again, I want to first just, a huge round of applause via Zoom for these folks. So, I also want to make sure to shout out to Nicole because she did an amazing job at, bringing these folks together. So bringing Juliana, bringing Emily, and bringing Debra as UPAC co-chairs. And also to you, Gabe, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your expertise and helping us, learn more about what does this look, what does advising look like? What do the services, the resources, what does the data tell us about advising at HSI? So again, super grateful that you all were able to take some time to, share this knowledge with not only folks at the University of Arizona, but I saw folks, from different places across the nation, which was amazing to always see, our community coming together. And then thank you all for the folks who are still here. I know folks had to hop off, but again, we're grateful for the time that you can spend with us again, learning and sharing knowledge and sharing who you are and where you all are from. Just so that you all know, our next webinar session will be on April 17th at 1 p.m. Arizona time, and we'll be joined by Dan Zayapan, who will talk about understanding the experiences of underrepresented faculty and staff in study abroad programs at Hispanic-Serving Institutions. So you can, if you haven't signed up for that one, you can do that on our website or through our social media. This was a recorded webinar, so we will be doing some minor edits to it, and then we'll be sharing that out on our YouTube as well as all our social media. So again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you in April.